The sun had barely risen over the distant mountains, casting the land in a gray, melancholic light. The wind howled through the barren hills, sweeping dust and dirt in every direction. There wasn't a soul in sight. The world seemed still, as though it had paused for a breath. But the silence, in all its desolation, was anything but peaceful. It was the silence of the frontier, harsh, unforgiving, and full of secrets buried deep in the earth. Rhett Walker, a solitary rancher in his mid-30s, sat atop his worn horse, staring into the vast, empty horizon. His face, weathered by the sun and time, bore the mark of a man who had seen too much, who had lived through violence and loss. The weight of solitude hung heavy on his broad shoulders, and he preferred it that way. The world was simpler when it was just him and the land. The people he used to call family were gone now, their faces fading in his memory like ghosts. His ranch, once a place of bustling life, had been reduced to ash. A life he had built, only to watch it burn to the ground at the hands of raiders. The fire had taken everything from him, except his hatred. With a sigh, he urged his horse forward. The steady rhythm of hooves on the dirt trail the only sound that accompanied him. His mind wandered, the memories flooding in as they always did, of his family's laughter, of the warmth of his wife's embrace, of the safety they had known before everything had been ripped away. But those memories were now tainted with the violence of the past. He thought of the men who had attacked his ranch, of the fires they set, of the family he had lost to their cruelty. He could still smell the smoke, still hear the screams in his nightmares. It was hard to let go of the anger, the urge for revenge, and the belief that there was no redemption for those who had hurt him. But today, the past seemed distant, buried, beneath the weight of a new, far more immediate concern. As Rhett's horse plodded along the worn trail, a strange sight caught his eye through the morning mist. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the fog, but as he drew closer, he realized that what he was seeing was no illusion. His heart sank. A young girl, barely more than a child, was hanging from a tree by a rope. Her body swayed gently in the breeze, her face pale and lifeless, a sign dangling from her neck. "White man don't forgive." The words, scrawled hastily on a piece of rough, weathered leather, sent a chill down Rhett's spine. The irony of it hit him like a slap to the face. He had spent so many years nursing his hatred for the Apache, believing them to be the enemy, the cause of all his suffering. But now, here was a young girl, a part of that world, left to die by the very people he had once sworn revenge against. Rhett's grip on the reins tightened, and he pulled his horse to a halt. His mind raced, a wave of confusion crashing over him. Who would do such a thing? And why this girl? What had she done to deserve such cruelty? Without thinking, he dismounted swiftly, his boots hitting the ground with a dull thud. The cold air bit at his skin as he made his way toward the tree, his boots crunching the frost-covered grass beneath him. He reached the girl, her lifeless body hanging like a forgotten doll, her face smeared with dirt and blood. Her hair, long and black, hung in tangled strands around her face, the wind tugging at it. The sign around her neck swayed in the breeze, as if mocking him, reminding him of everything he had once believed. That Rhett's heart pounded in his chest. He reached up and gently touched the rope, his fingers trembling. For a moment, he just stared at the girl, unable to move, his mind overwhelmed with the impossibility of the situation. What had she done to deserve this? How had she ended up here? He had seen death before, too much of it, but never like this. Not a young girl, left to die alone in the cold. With careful hands, he untied the rope, lowering her to the ground. Her body was limp in his arms, her breathing shallow and uneven. He knelt beside her, his heart pounding in his chest as he checked for signs of life. Her skin was cold to the touch, and her face was ashen, but there was a faint pulse, barely there, but it was enough. "Come on, girl," Rhett muttered, his voice rough with emotion. He wasn't sure what he was doing. He wasn't a healer, just a rancher. But there was something inside him, some instinct that told him he couldn't leave her there. Not like this. He scooped her up, cradling her against his chest as he mounted his horse once more. She was light, fragile in his arms, but the weight of the situation felt unbearable. The sign still hung from her neck, flapping in the wind, but Rhett didn't care. He had to get her to safety, to his ranch. He didn't know what he'd do with her. But he knew that leaving her there was not an option. As he spurred the horse forward, his thoughts began to swirl. The face of the young girl before him was etched in his mind. Her eyes, wide and full of fear, but also defiance, had caught him off guard. What had she been through? Why had she been left like that? Rhett's thoughts drifted to his own family, to the injustices they had faced. He had spent years building walls around his heart, closing himself off from the world. But now, as he looked down at the girl in his arms, he felt something shift. The road back to the ranch was long, and the ride was slow. The sun broke through the overcast sky as he reached his cabin, but it did little to warm the chill in his bones. Rhett carefully dismounted and carried the girl into the cabin. His heart still racing, that he laid her gently on the rough-hewn bed, his hands trembling as he began to tend to her wounds. He wasn't sure what would happen next. Would she even survive? Would she hate him when she woke up? He didn't know, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't leave her to die alone in the cold. As he worked, his mind wandered back to the past, to the violence that had shaped him, to the belief that there could be no forgiveness in this world. But something about this girl, something about the way she had been abandoned, made him wonder if there was a way forward, a way to move beyond the hatred and the pain. For now, he could only wait. But as the fire crackled in the hearth, Rhett couldn't shake the feeling that this girl, Naya, was going to change everything. The flicker of firelight cast long, shaky shadows against the wooden walls of the cabin. Rhett carefully laid Naya on a makeshift cot, her small body still too limp for comfort. Her skin was cold, her pulse weak but steady, and the dark stains of dried blood and dirt were smeared across her face. Rhett hadn't expected much. His cabin was modest, barely enough to survive in on his own. But he wasn't alone anymore, and his instincts told him to keep her safe, to care for her. That he moved quietly, gathering what little he had: bandages, water, a cloth, and a fire to keep them warm. His hands worked with practiced precision as he cleaned the cuts along Naya's arms, her neck, and her face, carefully avoiding any areas that might be too painful for her. She winced at each touch, though she remained mostly unconscious, her breath shallow and uneven. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words, and Rhett felt the weight of it. He'd never been good with people, especially not since the fire that had destroyed his family. He had built his life on solitude, finding comfort in the vast emptiness of the land. But now, he couldn't ignore the presence of the girl before him, this stranger who had been left to die. The fire crackled softly in the corner, and the smell of burning pine filled the cabin. Rhett placed the last of the bandages over the deepest of her wounds, his eyes lingering on her face. Her features were delicate, but there was an intensity to her, an anger and pain that was foreign to him, yet familiar. It reminded him of the day he had buried his wife and children, of the quiet rage that had consumed him in the years that followed. As the fire burned low, Rhett added another log, its warmth spreading through the room. He sat beside Naya, watching her carefully, waiting for some sign that she was waking up. He didn't know what he was supposed to do, how to talk to her, how to make her feel safe. Everything about this situation was wrong, but it was his responsibility. Now, he'd saved her life, and he wasn't about to let her slip away again. After a while, Naya stirred, a soft groan escaping her lips. Rhett leaned forward, his heart racing. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, revealing dark brown depths full of fear and confusion. She blinked several times, as if trying to make sense of her surroundings. When her gaze settled on him, Rhett felt the weight of her stare. Her lips parted slightly, and she muttered something in a language he didn't understand. "Easy," Rhett said quietly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "You're safe now." He spoke slowly, but his words seemed to fall flat in the room. She tried to sit up, but pain lanced through her body, and she collapsed back onto the bed, hissing between clenched teeth. Rhett reached out instinctively, but she flinched away from him, her eyes widening with distrust. "Don't touch me," she rasped, her voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. Rhett froze, his hands suspended in midair. He didn't know how to respond. Her words, though broken and foreign, carried a venom that was unmistakable. This wasn't just fear. This was hatred. Hatred for him, for what he represented. He was a white man, the enemy in her eyes, a reminder. of everything that had been done to her people. "I'm not here to hurt you," Rhett said quietly, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm just trying to help." But she didn't seem to believe him. She stared at him with defiance, her gaze hard, like she could see through him, to the core of what he had done to her kind. She shifted her body to the side, her muscles aching. As she moved, the bruises on her arms and legs were dark and angry, but they weren't the worst of it. The rope burns around her neck had left deep marks that would take weeks to heal. Rhett didn't know how to bridge the gap between them, but he could see the young girl in front of him wasn't just a victim of the elements. She was a victim of history. He had seen her kind before, in stories passed down through the generations. The Apache, the Navajo, the Sioux, all had suffered at the hands of the settlers, but none more so than the Apache. The raids had been brutal. The land had been claimed by force, the promise of peace broken time and time again. Rhett's own family had been caught in the middle of it all, once living side by side with the Apache, then pushed out when the settlers moved in with guns and fire. He remembered his father's words about the Apache, how they were the enemy, how they needed to be driven out. But it wasn't just his father's words that echoed in his head. It was the bloodshed, the burning of their farm, the coldness of the world that had left him alone. His thoughts drifted to the time when the raiders had come for them. He'd lost everything that day: his wife, his children, his home. The flames had consumed all he had ever known, leaving him with a hatred for those who had taken it. He had spent years alone, chasing vengeance, carrying the weight of his loss. But now, as he looked at Naya, a girl who had clearly suffered her own version of that pain, he wondered if there was more to the story than just anger. Naya shifted again, her body trembling. She looked at him, her eyes still full of distrust. But there was a flicker of something else, something softer, something human. Rhett swallowed, unsure of what to say next. "I'm sorry," he muttered, though the words felt foreign in his mouth. "For what happened to you. I can't change it, but I won't hurt you." She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze searching, assessing. Finally, she spoke again, this time in broken English. "White man, no forgive." Rhett's heart tightened at her words. He had heard those words before, many times, from the men who had burned his land, from the people who had sought revenge. But now, hearing them from this girl, the weight of it settled on him like a stone in his chest. "I'm not your enemy," he said, though he knew it wouldn't be enough. He didn't know how to make her see it, how to break through the years of hatred that had formed between their peoples. But all he could offer was this: his silence, his presence, and the small act of kindness that had led him to her in the first place. Over the next few days, Naya resisted him at every turn. She refused his food, his water, even the warmth of the fire. She stayed silent, her eyes often vacant, as if lost in a world of her own. Rhett respected her space, but never left her side, knowing that the only way to keep her safe was to be there, even if she resented his presence. But slowly, ever so slowly, Naya began to share small pieces of her story. She spoke of her people, of the raids, of the fire that had consumed her village. She spoke in quiet, broken English, but every word felt like a weight being lifted. Rhett listened, understanding for the first time the true cost of the world he had once believed in. The tension between them remained, thick and palpable, but it was no longer just hatred. There was something else beneath it, a shared understanding, a fragile bond being formed in the silence. Neither of them knew what the future held, but for now, they would have to find a way to coexist. And for the first time in years, Rhett wondered if forgiveness was possible, if it could begin, even in a place as broken as this. The days turned to weeks as Rhett and Naya spent more time together in the quiet isolation of the ranch. The once distant silence between them gradually shifted. Naya no longer lay in bed all day, her eyes dull with distrust and fear. As she regained her strength, the walls between them began to crack. Rhett noticed it first in the way she watched him, the tension slowly easing from her face, replaced with a cautious curiosity. She had begun to speak more, her words short, fragmented, but they were words nonetheless. Rhett, in turn, began to listen differently. At first, he had only heard the bitterness in her voice, the anger that colored her every sentence. He had expected that. After all, the Apache had been painted as the enemy for so long, especially by the settlers. He had grown up on stories of raids and bloodshed. But as he spent more time with Naya, the truth of it began to settle on him like a weight, and he found himself seeing the world through her eyes. It wasn't just the fire in her gaze that made him realize how little he had understood about the Apache plight. It was the small things, how she had avoided eye contact with him when he tried to share a meal, how she couldn't bring herself to trust the safety of the cabin. She was used to violence and betrayal. She had been taught that anyone who wasn't Apache couldn't be trusted. And the pain, the deep-rooted pain in her face, spoke of years of conflict, years of loss, years of survival at all costs. He had once believed that the anger and resentment in his heart were justified, that his suffering at the hands of raiders gave him the right to hate. But now, the more he listened to Naya's soft voice, her stories of home, of her people, the more he realized how misplaced his own anger had been. The settlers had been the ones who started the fires, who came to take everything, who drove the native people from their land. Rhett's family, too, had been victims, but Naya's people had been suffering long before he ever felt the sting of loss. One evening, as the fire crackled low in the hearth, Naya finally spoke more than just the few words she had offered before. She sat across from Rhett, staring into the flames, her hands wrapped tightly around the cup of water he had given her. He watched her for a moment, then, with a gentle voice, asked, "Why didn't they just let you be? Why did they come after your village?" At first, Naya didn't answer, but after a long moment of silence, her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of her memories had grown too heavy to bear. She began to speak, her words slow and labored as if they were difficult to form. "The raiders, they came in the night. I don't remember much. The fire was so bright. My father, he tried to protect us, but they killed him. My mother too." Her voice cracked, and she looked down, a tear slipping down her cheek. "They killed many. My brothers, my cousins. They took the land, the cattle. They took everything." Rhett sat frozen, the weight of her words sinking deep into him. The anger he had once carried, directed at the Apache, at the people who had destroyed his life, felt so small now. In comparison, the suffering Naya had lived through was endless. This wasn't just a girl from another tribe. She was a person who had lost everything, who had been forced to survive in a world where survival was not a given. "I'm sorry," Rhett said quietly, his voice thick with regret. "I didn't know. I never understood." Naya's eyes flickered, up to meet his. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "You don't have to apologize." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had grown up hearing that the Apache were the enemy, that they were dangerous. But here, in front of him, was a young girl, her people's land taken, her family murdered, and all she wanted was survival. The anger that had fueled him for so long felt like nothing more than an empty, meaningless rage. "I didn't know," he said again. But this time it wasn't an apology, it was a realization. He had been so consumed by his own suffering that he had never stopped to think about what others had endured. How could he have? How could anyone? Naya looked at him for a moment longer before her eyes dropped back to the fire. "I've never trusted anyone," she said softly. "I have learned not to." There was a finality in her words, but it wasn't cold. It was a reflection of the life she had been forced to live, a life where trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Rhett sat back, a sharp ache spreading through his chest. He wasn't just seeing her as a victim anymore. He saw a person who had survived where so many others had not, who had fought for her very life. In the days that followed, their bond continued to grow, albeit slowly. Rhett began to teach Naya how to care for the horses. He showed her how to saddle them, how to brush their coats, how to ride without fear. In turn, Naya taught him small words in Apache. She laughed when he butchered the pronunciation, and Rhett, despite the strange feeling of vulnerability it gave him, found himself laughing too. Slowly, the silence that had once stretched between them began to fade. Words became less guarded, less hesitant. Despite the growing trust between them, the reality of their situation wasn't far from Rhett's mind. His protection of Naya wasn't without its risks. He had seen the way people in town looked at him when he ventured into the store to buy supplies. He knew the whispers would grow louder. He had been away from town for so long, but the settlers wouldn't forget. They wouldn't forgive him for hiding an Apache girl. Rhett didn't want to admit it, but the thought gnawed at him constantly. His life, His choices had led him down this lonely path. But now, it wasn't just his own life that was at stake. It was hers. As the days passed, the tension began to rise. One afternoon, as Rhett worked on the fence by the barn, he heard the distant sound of hooves approaching, 3 men on horseback. His heart tightened. He had seen them before. They were settlers from the neighboring town, men who didn't take kindly to Apache people, no matter their age or circumstance. His hand instinctively went to the rifle slung across his shoulder. He didn't know what they wanted, but he was ready. They had tracked Naya down, and now he had a choice: to protect her at all costs, or to send her away to save them both. Rhett stood at the edge of the barn, watching as the men drew closer. He didn't have a plan, not yet. But one thing was clear: his loyalty was no longer to the anger of his past. It was to Naya, to the girl who had changed everything, whether he was ready for it or not. The sound of hooves reached Rhett's ears long before he saw the riders. It was a familiar sound, one that had made his heart race with anxiety countless times before. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't just his life on the line, it was hers. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the ranch. The air had a chill to it, a reminder that winter was coming, and with it, new dangers. Rhett had been expecting them. He had seen the signs, the way the townsfolk looked at him when he passed through, the murmurs in the saloon. They had learned about Naya. They had learned that he was hiding her. As the riders drew closer, Rhett stood tall, his back straight, his jaw clenched in determination. He had never backed down from a fight, but this was different. He knew the stakes. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for Naya's, for the chance she deserved to live free from the hatred and violence that had haunted her people for generations. The riders pulled up to the cabin, dust swirling around them. As they dismounted, there were 4 men, their faces grim, their eyes hard with anger. Rhett recognized them as settlers from the nearby town, men who had heard rumors of the Apache girl hiding on his land and had come to put an end to it. "What's this, Walker?" one of them called, his voice thick with disdain. "You're sheltering one of them? One of those savages?" The word savage was spat like poison, the hatred in his tone unmistakable. Rhett stood his ground, his hand resting lightly on the rifle slung across his shoulder. "She's under my protection," he said, his voice steady, though his heart raced in his chest. "And I won't be handing her over to you." The men looked at each other, their eyes narrowing. "You're making a mistake, Walker," another man said, stepping forward. "This is your last warning. Hand her over, and we'll leave you alone." Rhett's eyes flicked over to the cabin where Naya was standing in the doorway, watching the confrontation unfold. She had been quietly observing for days, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. But now, as the men's demands grew louder, something inside her stirred, a strength that had been buried deep inside her since the moment she was captured. With a steady breath, Naya stepped forward, her movements calm, almost measured. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady, her words carrying a quiet authority that made the men pause. "You don't scare me," she said, her voice cold but not afraid. "I fear nothing that you can do to me. You are not my enemy. My people's enemy is the world that has left us to die." Rhett looked at Naya, his heart swelling with pride. In that moment, she was no longer the scared girl who had clung to him for protection. She had found her voice, and with it, a quiet defiance. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting for the future of her people. The men shifted uneasily on their feet, brandishing rifles and pistols, their hands twitching nervously as they realized Naya wasn't afraid. But that didn't stop them. They were used to taking what they wanted, to imposing their will on those they deemed weaker. They weren't prepared for this. This girl who stood before them, unyielding, unbroken. "I'm not going to tell you." Again, Walker, the leader of the group, growled. "Step aside, or we'll make you move." Rhett's fingers curled around the rifle, the weight of it grounding him. He knew this was the moment of truth, the moment when everything would change. He could feel the tension thick in the air, the deadly silence hanging between them like a taut rope ready to snap. "I won't let you take her," Rhett said, his voice low but resolute. "You'll have to go through me first." The men sneered, but there was a flicker of hesitation in their eyes. They had come expecting an easy confrontation, But they hadn't accounted for the steadfast resolve of a man who had lost everything, who had seen too much bloodshed to back down now. For a long moment, the two sides stood facing each other, locked in an unspoken battle of wills. Rhett's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood firm. His hand tightened around the rifle, ready to defend Naya at all costs. Just as the standoff reached its peak, the sound of hooves broke the silence. Rhett turned his head to see a figure riding swiftly toward them. Sheriff Callahan, a man Rhett had known for years, a man who had always tried to do what was right. The sheriff's horse skidded to a stop in front of the group, and he dismounted quickly, his eyes scanning the tense scene before him. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" The sheriff asked, his voice calm but authoritative. The settlers immediately turned on him, their anger flaring. "This man is hiding an Apache girl. He's helping the enemy," one of them shouted. The sheriff's eyes flicked to Rhett, then to Naya, who stood with her head held high, unflinching in the face of their hatred. A slow, knowing look passed between him and Rhett. The sheriff had always been sympathetic to the Apache cause, but he had never openly defied the settlers before. "You're mistaken," the sheriff said evenly. "The fight you're looking for isn't here. These men are no enemy to you. They are survivors, just like the rest of us." He stepped forward, and with a motion that was almost too swift to follow, the sheriff drew his own pistol, pointing it at the group of settlers. "Now, I suggest you get on your horses and leave, before this situation gets out of hand." The settlers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances, but the sheriff's calm authority was enough to make them think twice. They muttered angrily but mounted their horses and turned, retreating into the distance. The tension in the air lingered for a few moments more before it finally broke, leaving the land in an uneasy silence as the riders disappeared over the horizon. Rhett let out a long breath, his grip on the rifle loosening. He turned to Naya, who was still standing tall, her gaze never leaving the road where the settlers had vanished. "Thank you," Rhett said quietly, his voice full of emotion. "For standing with me." Naya nodded, her face softening for the first time in days. "You saved me," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. Rhett's heart swelled, and in that moment, he realized how far they had come. The anger, the hatred, the years of isolation, they were all gone, replaced by something stronger, something better. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building a future. In the days that followed, Rhett made his decision. He would not let Naya return to the world that had abandoned her. He would not let her be just another casualty of history. He formally adopted her, signing the papers that would make her his daughter, his family. They would work together on the ranch, building a future not defined by the past, but by the strength of the bond they had formed. Rhett sat on the porch one evening, watching Naya care for the horses. He thought back on everything that had led him here, the anger, the loss, the pain. He had spent so long searching for forgiveness in others, never realizing that the forgiveness he needed most was for himself. And as the first rays of dawn broke over the land, Rhett knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But with Naya by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. They were no longer just survivors. They were family, and together, they would forge a new future.